I'm a little late to the game as You Season 2 came out yesterday, but forgive me, it was Christmas alright. Anyway, with that said, here is a recap of You Season 1. Joe Goldberg is the manager of a bookstore and he notices a woman who's wandering about. Her name? Guinevere Beck, an aspiring writer. Joe has a neighbour called Claudia, who has a son Paco, and abusive boyfriend Ron. Joe begins to stalk Beck on social media, and then in real life also, peering into her windows, having a look around, and checking her out at her job. He finds out that she has a pervy professor, and an on and off again boyfriend Benji. Joe, after stalking Beck to an open mic bar, finds her at the train station drunk, and saves her after she falls on the tracks. Just a bit of a foreshadow here, under the bookstore is some sort of glass chamber, supposedly used to simply store fragile books. Pretending to be her boyfriend, Joe reports a potential gas leak in her apartment, therefore being able to get in, and he looks around, taking her underwear and looking on her computer. Joe lended Paco a rare book, and Ron found it and ripped it up. Joe tells Paco about a good hiding place in the ceiling above the bathroom. Seeing that Benji isn't good for Beck, Joe lures him into the glass cage, trapping him. Joe mentions a past girlfriend, Candice. Anyway, Joe and Beck get a drink with each other and it turns out Joe had stolen Beck's phone when he saved her the other night. Benji, when in the cage, recognizes him as the guy who saved Beck and tells him what she is really like. Joe gets into Benji's phone and pretends to be him, explaining his disappearance. Beck meets with her professor, but when groped, meets with Joe again instead. She invites him to Peach's party, one of her friends. Peach and Joe don't get on, and just as Joe and Beck go to leave, an old friend of Candice recognizes Joe, stating how weird it was when Candice just disappeared. After a kiss with Beck, Joe delivers a coffee to Benji, but it contains nuts, of which he's allergic to, killing him. Beck asks about Candice a little as he tries to figure out how to get rid of Benji's body. Sending Paco to go get some supplies, the power in the bookstore suddenly goes out, meaning the body deteriorates faster. Ron finds Paco with the list and reports Joe to the police, but he's able to convince them it's for his garden plot. Whilst burning the body, he's almost caught as Beck rings him. Using her old phone to spy on her, Joe's convinced she's cheating on him with some older guy. It turns out to be her father, who she said had died of an overdose when she was little. With Peach and Joe still not seeing eye to eye, he steals her laptop, finding hundreds of photos of Beck naked or barely dressed. Thinking it's the only way, he attacks Peach and runs away. Somehow surviving, she thinks she has a stalker. Using this opportunity, Peach convinces Beck to go away with her for a bit. Joe follows, not trusting her. He crashes his car, hitting his head, but continues to go and break into Peach's house. Joe begins to have visions of Candice walking around, showing us that she cheated on him, pretending it was her brother calling and texting her. He eventually finds a gun in the house and hides as Beck and Peach have an argument, resulting in Beck leaving. Peach finds Joe knocking him out and shooting him in the leg. Joe manages to knock her down and grabs the gun, killing her. He makes a fake suicide note for her and leaves the house. The next thing we see is Joe in a therapy room and his relationship with Beck is over. Beck began working at Mooney's bookstore and starts seeing a therapist herself. Joe thinks her secrecy is her cheating on him. He started to go see the same therapist, pretending to be someone else so that he can break in and listen to the recordings of Beck's sessions with him. Realizing she wasn't cheating on him, he breaks her old phone, wanting to move on, hooking up with Karen, a friend of Claudia's. 3 months later, and Beck has managed to get a book deal, and Joe and Karen are good together. They bump into each other, which makes Joe and Beck start texting each other again. Claudia is an addict, and so Joe and Karen take her to the cage to allow her to detox, with Paco living with Joe temporarily. Whilst this goes on, Joe cheats on Karen with Beck, eventually ending it with her to be with Beck. Karen goes to see Beck, telling her to be careful not to end up like Candice. Joe wakes up, calling out that name, and Beck hears, but pretends to be asleep. She begins to ask about her, trying to find out what happened to her. Asking Ethan, Joe's colleague, talking to old friends, finding out that she cheated on Joe with Elijah, the person who signed her to her first label. Joe confronted Elijah, pushing him off a roof. Beck confronts Joe about all of this. He explains it all away, but we found out Mr. Mooney, the owner of the bookstore, Joe's mentor and closest thing to a father figure, knew about Elijah and helped Joe not get caught. He has taken care of him since he was very young, even if he was a little harsh. Beck starts getting calls and Joe finds out it's her therapist, Dr. Nikki. She had been cheating after all. He confronts Beck, but they resolve the issue and Joe's dreams about Candace stop. Pucker gives a book back to Beck as Joe went out to get breakfast. He tells her about the hiding place Joe told him about. Curious, she checks the spot above the toilet in the ceiling, finding a box full of her clothes he stole, the phones of Peach, Benji and her, as well as Candace's necklace and a jar of teeth. Joe returns to the apartment, finds the jar smashed on the floor and grabs Beck, taking her to the glass cage. During this, Ron gave Claudia a concussion, putting her in hospital, and Pucko is nowhere to be seen. Joe shows Beck a video Benji showed him for blackmail to ensure his silence if he was let free. It's of him and friends accidentally killing someone. As well as this, he shows her the pictures of Peach had of her, trying to explain why he did what he did. Pucko, meanwhile, attempts to steal the gun from the bookstore to kill Ron. Joe meets with Beck's friends, convincing them she's on a writer's retreat, and finds out about this PI investigating the death of Peach. Pucko attacks Ron and runs off, with Joe finding them, killing Ron. He gets rid of the body and Pucko keeps the secret. Beck, whilst in the cage, had been writing. She wrote about her story with her therapist and how it was him obsessed with her, showing Joe a way out of this. She sweet talks him into opening the cage, stabbing him and locking him inside instead. He has a spare key, however, and grabs Beck, killing her. 4 months later, Beck has a book released, the writing about the therapist. Joe had left the box of evidence in his home, leading to him being arrested instead of Joe. Pucko and Claudia move away, starting a fresh life, and Joe, well, he notices a woman in the bookstore. It's Candace.
Candace? You're
alive. Yeah. So, I think we have some unfinished business to talk about.